with few forces remaining to resist Piankhy's victorious march northward. The text takes full advantage of the dramatic moment. The old fortress of Persekum Kapora, built by Osorkon I 2 centuries earlier, was prepared for a siege. However, Piankhy's commanding words alone were enough to shake the defenders. "You who live as if already dead. Miserable souls, if you don't open the gate at once, consider yourselves finished." The gates opened, the garrison surrendered. And another of Tefnich's sons was captured by the Nubians. Piankhy used a similar blunt threat at Medum. About 16 miles further north, you have a choice: open the gate and live, or keep it shut and die. The response was immediate. The gates opened, and Piankhy entered the town without resistance. The next fortress, Ijtoimadan Lisht, located 12 miles north of Medum, didn't wait for Piankhy's ultimatum. As soon as his army approached, the defenders surrendered, without a fight. While these 3 strongholds, which formed a defensive line near the Fayum, were valuable gains for Piankhy, they were insignificant compared to Memphis. These forts might have resisted longer, perhaps hoping for reinforcements from the delta. But Piankhy's swift tactics and the unexpected strength of his southern army left them no chance. When he reached Memphis, Piankhy tried persuasion once more. Let the ancient city of Shu not resist. If someone wants to come in, let him enter. If someone wants to leave, let him go. No one will stop them. I only wish to make offerings to Ptah and the gods of Memphis. But the people of Memphis were more defiant than he expected. They had no patience for his smooth talk. Their response was swift and determined. Reminiscent of the citizens who later resisted the Mandesian army against Nectinabotu, or the tradesmen and shopkeepers who defended Londonderry in 1690. Memphis closed its gates and sent out its own forces made up of artisans, builders, and sailors to confront Piankhy's troops. Piankhy, like Rosen at Londonderry, was enraged by what he saw as an insult. Neither leader seemed to grasp that they were facing genuine grassroots resistance. At the time, of course, the will of the people meant little compared to what was believed to be the will of the gods. Yet this failure to understand their enemies may have been a recurring flaw in the dynasty, a weakness that, 50 years later, would lead to Nubia's eventual loss of control over the North Dot in the summer of 717 BC. Victory came swiftly and predictably for the Sudanese warlord. Tefnech had reinforced Memphis by raising its walls and allowing the river to reach the eastern fortifications. He stationed a garrison of 8,000 men to defend the city. However, he was not personally present during the crisis. Scribe wastes no time accusing him of cowardice, noting that Tefnech snuck into the city under cover of darkness to rally his troops, only to flee again before dawn, riding off on horseback, not even bothering with his chariot heading north in fear of the king. The next day, Piankhy completed the encirclement of Memphis and set up his camp to the north near the harbor. During a council of war, some officers suggested laying formal siege to the city, but this idea was likely dismissed due to the size and strength of the garrison. Instead, Piankhy's proposal to launch a direct assault on the harbor was approved. The merchant fleet anchored in the Memphis harbor was seized and repurposed to transport troops for the attack. Piankhy issued an immediate command: advance on the city, scale the walls, and move through the riverside houses. Anyone who gets over the wall must not linger, push forward before the enemy can regroup. Anyone who hesitates is a coward. It took just a single day. The city fell like a sudden storm, and many were killed. The residents of nearby towns panicked, opened their fortresses, and fled in every direction. No one knew where they had gone. Asterisk, whether he realized it or not. Piankhy had just fought his final major battle in the campaign. His remaining actions, as recorded on the stela, were notably restrained. He made the customary offerings to the gods of the newly liberated city. In this case, Ptah confiscated its treasures and paid a routine visit to Heliopolis to worship. From there, his fleet and army traveled to Athribis, about 35 kilometers north along the main branch of the Nile in the delta, and set up camp just east of the city. This last stage of Piankhy's northern campaign was likely carried out at the invitation of Pidiazi, the local prince of Athribis. Pidiaz, along with Achanish of Sebeniotos and Olat, king of Leontopolis, had been among the first to come before Piankhy after the fall of Memphis. Pidiaz likely hoped to serve as a mediator and prevent further conflict. He had strong credentials. For the role, he had married a descendant of Shoshank III, who had once turned Athribis into a fief for a secondary branch of Egypt's 22nd dynasty. By this time, Piankhy shared authority in the region with his brother-in-law. Nesno Piankhy probably played a key role in persuading other regional leaders, princes, chieftains, and mayors of the central and eastern delta to abandon Tefnekt and make peace with Piankhy while he was still in Athribis. In total, 15 of them came to Piankhy's camp. However, the terms Piankhy imposed were surprisingly light. Unlike his earlier seizures of treasure in southern forts, here he simply asked for gifts of horses and the ceremonial regalia of each. Delta Prince, the arrangement with Tefnekt himself, is even more curious. According to the Stealer, when Tefnekt learned that many of his allies in Lower Egypt had switched sides, he sent a messenger apparently from his base in Sastu Piankhy's camp. His message was a desperate plea for mercy, poetic in form but possibly exaggerated. It's uncertain whether he actually said what was written. Piankhy didn't confront him in person. Instead, he sent his chief lector, Pediamunebnesatwi, to Sais to accept Tefnekt's submission. The result was underwhelming. The envoy returned with a token gift and a very short oath from Tefnekt. In just a few sentences, he promised not to defy Piankhy's commands or trouble his neighbors. Compared to the more elaborate treaty oaths common at the time, Tefnekt's pledge was shockingly brief and lacking in detail. There's something odd about the way events unfolded. The Nubian advance had seemed unstoppably fortified city. Even Memphis itself had fallen with little resistance. Yet after that, all Piankhy managed was a kind of diplomatic meeting with his enemies, rather than a final, decisive victory. Over 18 major cities in the Delta, many likely fortified, were still unconquered, and Tefnekt, the central figure of opposition, didn't even bother to meet Piankhy face to face. It's hard not to suspect that the long string of sieges, battles, and campaigns had worn down the Nubian forces. By the time Memphis was taken, the Delta's resistance was disorganized and weak. But Piankhy himself may also have been drained of energy and momentum. What followed was mostly ceremonial, formal agreements to end hostilities, polite declarations of submission, and the offering of token gifts. After withdrawing to the south, Piankhy likely held little real influence north of Heracleopolis. However, records show that he maintained control over the oases as late as his 24th regnal year, 713 BC, suggesting that he was still recognized as ruler in Middle Egypt. The Thebaid, as always, remained loyal to the Nubians, but Memphis stood apart. It refused to recognize Piankhy's authority and continued to support Sais as the political center. Given that endorsement from the priesthood of Memphis often meant official legitimacy, Piankhy's failure to win them over meant that, in the end, he had lost the final and most symbolic struggle with his rival, Tefnekt. Tefnekt died not long after Piankhy withdrew from Egypt, though he managed before his death to dedicate a piece of land within his territory to the goddess Night of Sais. Aside from later legends that emerged around his name, this is the last recorded detail. About this remarkable and rebellious founder, he was already in middle age by then. 2 of his adult sons had been lost in the conflict with Piankhy, but a third survived to take his place. As far as we know, Piankhy did not oppose the rise of Tefnekt's son, Baconrinef, who is more widely recognized by the Greek version of his royal name, Bokhoris Walker. In later times, Bokhoris became a notable figure in legend, though it's unclear exactly why. It's true that certain historical characters in Egypt, especially those remembered for their wisdom or eccentricity, often became the subjects of floating folklore motifs. But Bokhoris wasn't a heroic figure, nor was he frequently featured in these traditional tales, apart from one well-known exception. This leaves us questioning whether some elements of the classical stories about him might contain a kernel of truth. To begin with, ancient sources claimed that Bokhoris was physically unattractive and had a greedy personality. One account states that, after the great kings of Shafran and Mysorenis, Bokhoris came to power, man considered utterly contemptible in appearance but more intelligent than any king before him. He was described as physically weak and extremely stingy. This contrast between an unappealing exterior and sharp intellect is not unusual in Egyptian storytelling, where the grotesque could be associated with wisdom. Many wise individuals were thought to suffer from some physical imperfection. Artistic styles from the late 8th and early 7th centuries BC sometimes portrayed rulers with stocky builds and pronounced facial features that may have been seen as unattractive by later standards, but we have no evidence that Bokharis himself was depicted in this way. More significantly, Bokharis developed a reputation for legal wisdom. According to Diodorus, Greek sources included him among 7 great lawgivers of ancient Egypt, placing him 4th in rank. He was known as a clever and cunning ruler who established laws specifically governing the conduct of kings and refined the legal rules concerning contracts. His judgments were considered so wise that some were still remembered long after his death. He is credited with laws that addressed borrowing and lending. For instance, if someone took out a loan without a written agreement and denied the debt, they could be cleared simply by swearing an oath. On the other hand, if a loan was backed by a written contract, lenders were forbidden to collect more than double the original amount through interest. Bokharis also ruled that debts could only be recovered from a person's property, not from the debtors. Body meaning debtors could not be imprisoned or enslaved for unpaid loans. The supposed reforms credited to Bokharis can be summarized into 4 main innovations: a law defining royal authority provision, allowing debts to be cancelled based on an oath alone, a cap on interest rates, a ban on securing loans with the debtor's own body. Historians have debated whether these traditions should be taken as fact. In Egypto-Hellenic historical writing, it's common for figures who mark the end of a royal line, often viewed as tragic heroes, to be remembered for their wisdom. The economic troubles that came with the decline and collapse of Egypt's 22nd dynasty in the early 8th century likely sparked public concern, especially about predatory lending. In this environment, borrower-friendly laws would have been especially needed during the final decades of that century. The idea that Bokharis passed a law on kingship also seems plausible. As Libyan rule weakened, power fractured, and smaller, locally established kingdoms took root. These independent rulers, along with the structured hierarchy of local leaders mentioned in the Piankhy stela, created a complex and decentralized political landscape. Bokharis may have attempted to dismantle parts of this system, which could have ultimately led to his downfall. Another, more mysterious aspect of Bokharis's legend casts him as a prophetic figure, at least someone whose reign was linked to powerful visions of the future. This idea appears in several different stories. In one, he is transformed into Necho, the sage Nechepso, a sage skilled in reading the stars. In another, a sacred ram delivers a vision warning of Egypt's future disasters. These prophecies typically involve invasions by northern foreigners, and during Ptolemaic times, such tales were often used in Jewish and pagan debates to explain the Hebrew presence in Egypt and the Exodus. All of this is extremely difficult to sort out. Prophecy played a meaningful role in Egyptian religion and folklore, but it remains unclear why Bokharis's reign, in particular, became associated with such visions. Other legendary rulers like Snefru, Khufu, Menkaure, and Amenhotep III are more typical subjects of prophetic tales. Bokharis, by contrast, is not typically viewed in the same esteemed company. It's true that his reign coincided with a major turning point in Egyptian history and invasion that led to a change in regime. However, that invasion came from the south, not the north, and those southern conquerors became so culturally integrated that they were ultimately embraced by Egyptian tradition. The prophecy involving the sacred ram implies that a plague or similar crisis triggered the call to expel foreign rulers. Yet there is no historical evidence of a plague occurring in Egypt between 717 and 711 BC. As previously noted, the historical Bokharis left behind very little in the way of contemporary records. This is perhaps not surprising, given that his home city of Sais has not yet been excavated to modern archaeological standards. Still, one might expect some references to him in the relatively well-documented records of Western Asia, and Memphis, Bockhoris, inherited a very limited realm. His authority did not extend into Middle Egypt or the Western Oases, and even within the Delta, his power was restricted. Local chiefs retained control over their own territories, and Osorkon IV continued to rule at Bubastis, although the priesthood in Memphis recognized Bokharis as pharaoh. Many of the Delta leaders maintained their independence, at least initially, despite his limited control. Bokharis did engage with foreign powers to the north and east, both diplomatically and militarily. Scarabs, bearing his name Wakar, have been found in late 8th century tombs on the island of Ischia, possibly indicating trade links. Greek tradition later associated Bokharis's reign with the founding of colonies such as Cyrene and Naucratis, though the dating of Naucratis's foundation is likely incorrect. Nevertheless, there is little doubt that the final decades of the 8th century saw an influx of Greek merchants along the eastern Mediterranean coast to the northeast. Assyria had firmly established itself along Egypt's frontier during Bokharis's time. The Assyrians secured control of the Wadi el-Arish region, deported rebellious locals, and placed a regional chieftain in charge as a kind of border governor. They also relocated groups of captives from the Zagros Mountains, Babylonia, and the Arabian Desert to areas like Philistia and Samaria, possibly aiming to access Africa's wealth while monitoring Egyptian activities. Sargon, the king of Assyria, set up a trading post between Gaza and Raphia. Egyptians were invited to come and trade there. This initiative appeared to be well received. Sargon later recorded that Shelkani, king of Egypt, a distant land, was awed by the splendor of Ashur, my lord, and sent me a gift of 12 fine Egyptian horses, the likes of which do not exist in Assyria. The name Shilkoni is believed to reflect the contemporary pronunciation of Osorkon, identifying the sender as Osorkon IV of the 23rd dynasty, who ruled from Bubastis. In 713 BC, a certain Pyre, king of Egypt, became entangled in a more dangerous confrontation with Assyria. Early that year, a man by that name was approached by Yamani, a usurper who had seized control of the Philistine city of Ashdod. Yamani was seeking support in his rebellion against Sargon of Assyria. The uprising appeared poised to draw in other states across the southern Levant. Records from the time state that the kings of Philistia, Judah, Edom, and Moab nations along the Mediterranean, who regularly paid tribute to Assyria, sent both their offerings and seditious messages to Pyre, king of Egypt. Although the rebellion ultimately failed, and Yamani fled to Nubia for refuge, Egypt's involvement, direct or indirect, left a mark. The episode tarnished Pyre and left Egypt diplomatically compromised. Identifying who this Pyre actually was is not straightforward. The name doesn't refer to an individual, but rather to a title what the Greeks would later render as pharaoh, a term derived from the Egyptian pera, meaning great house. It's unlikely that this referred to Osorkon IV as Assyrian. Scribes were already familiar with his personal name. Moreover, just 12 years earlier, the kingdom of Israel had reached out to the king of Egypt in says clearly referring to Tefnekt. Given that, it's most probable that Pyre, king of Egypt, in the Ashdod affair was none other than Bokharis, Tefnekt's successor. Ruling from the same seat of power, *** contemporary records are silent on how Bokharis met his end, but later, folklore and king list traditions offer more dramatic versions. One tale, told to Herodotus in the 5th century BC, described a blind king named Anusis. According to the story, he fled into the marshes of the delta at the start of the Kushite invasion and lived there in hiding on an island made of ashes, only returning after the Kushite ruler Sabako withdrew from Egypt, another tradition preserved. In the version of the Egyptian king list recorded by Manetho, claims that Sabako captured Bokharis and had him burned alive. If the Egyptiaca began as a king list that was occasionally expanded with brief narrative details, then the grim fate mentioned in the version passed down by Africanus likely represents a condensed form of a longer, more detailed story. Execution by fire was not unheard of in the ancient world, typically reserved for political crimes like treason, though it was used for other serious offenses as well. The tale of hiding in marshes could easily have been inspired by the geography of Sais, Bokharis's home city, since Egypt's marshlands were historically seen as a place of refuge. But death by fire fits the political climate of the time. The Sais dynasty was known for its intolerance of competing royal claims within Egypt, and Bokharis, like his father, Tefnekt before him, may have been trying to restore a centralized pharaonic system, essentially a kind of federal monarchy. During the 8th century, under rulers like Shashank III and IV, Egypt had become fragmented into local kingdoms created by individual cities or regions. These independent rulers challenged the authority and unity of the traditional pharaonic state. Bokhris may have viewed their continued rule as a direct threat and moved to eliminate figures like Osorkon, known to the Assyrians as Shilkani of the 23rd dynasty, or other powerful kings such as Peftajawabast of Heraclaplis and Namlut of Hermopolisif. They were still alive at the time. However, many of these local rulers were allies of the Kushite royal house based in Napata. Piankhy, the Kushite king, had even ordered Tefnekht not to interfere with his neighboring rulers. While Bokhris might have argued that he was not bound by his father's promise, Piankhy, now aging, may have lacked the will or strength to respond. His younger brother Sabako, however, may have been more eager to act. Motivated by personal ambition or a sense of loyalty to his allies, Sabako took decisive action, possibly against Bokhris, himself bringing an end to his reign in dramatic fashion. Within a year of Piankhy's death, in 712 BC, events unfolded with striking speed. Egypt's involvement in the failed Ashdod rebellion ended in disaster, and the defeated rebel fled up the Nile Valley. Sabako, newly ascended to the Kushite throne, unexpectedly found himself offering refuge, perhaps unwillingly, to the fugitive. Around the same time, Osorkon died, leaving Bokhris as the only remaining claimant to power in the Delta. The course of events was now set. From the Kushite perspective, Bokhris had no rightful claim to the throne. He had not followed the precedent established by his father, which required swearing an oath of allegiance to the new Kushite king. In the autumn of 712 BC, the Kushite army advanced north into Egypt. As Piankhy's forces had done just 5 years earlier, they crushed the last remnants of native resistance, scratched or painted on objects buried within Apis bull at Saqqara, which happened to die around that time. These inscriptions offer a brief, poignant glimpse into the feelings of a population that still associated the moment with Bokhris's reign and remained loyal to him. After that, the historical record falls silent. The final chapter of Bokhris's life is lost to time, ***, unlike his older brother Piankhy. Sabako did not withdraw to Napata after his conquest of northern Egypt. Instead, Thebes emerged as a central hub of the new regime, strengthened by the presence of his sister Amenetis, who held the powerful religious position of divine adoratress of Amen. Whether Sabako himself made Thebes his permanent residence remains uncertain, although Sabako and his successors occasionally wore the traditional crowns of the pharaohs. They often favored the snug-fitting Nubian cap, adorned with streamers and a double uraeus. This headdress became almost a symbol of the union between Egypt and Kush. Looking to Egypt's distant past for legitimacy and inspiration, Sabako adopted the royal name of Pepi II, the longest-reigning pharaoh in Egyptian history, taking the prenomen Nef. He also signaled the beginning of a new era by choosing the title, "He who makes the two lens glisten," as his primary epithet for the first and only time until the 19th century AD. The entire Nile Valley, stretching over 1,500 miles from Nubia to the Mediterranean Sea, was united under a single centralized government. Sabako's swift military campaign and the seamless incorporation of Lower Egypt into his domain effectively blocked any plans the Assyrians may have had concerning their southern border. From 711 BC onward, for the next 50 years, Egypt projected the image of a strong, if not entirely unified, front against northern threats. This appearance of strength alone was enough to dissuade any direct challenge from Assyria. Egypt, along with Moab and Edom, became recognized as the southern boundary of Sargon's empire. However, there are signs that while Sabako initially maintained control, he began to transfer power to his brother and future successor Shebetku within 7 years of his conquest. By 705 BC, Shebetku was already acting as co-regent. At first, Shebetku pursued a more diplomatic and conciliatory approach toward Sargon II. Notably, he refused to shelter Yamani the rebel, who had earlier fled to Kush for asylum and instead surrendered him to the Assyrians. Archaeological finds at Nimrod in the palace of Sennacherib include seals and ceilings bearing Sabako's name, suggesting that correspondence once existed between Egypt and Assyria, though the original documents have been lost. These finds point to some level of formal communication and, perhaps, even a begrudging recognition between the two powers. Exactly what led to the eventual breakdown in relations remains unclear. Since Assyria's revival under Assurpal II in 911 BC, its westward expansion had relied on the conquest of Syrian city-states and the strategic control, or at least the neutralization, of the Levantan ports. Egypt had remained largely indifferent to Assyrian advances into inland Syria. However, when Assyrian campaigns targeted the Phoenician coastal cities, they threatened Egypt's long-established sphere of influence, which had extended over this region for 2,000 years. Both Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon II sought to undermine Judah, then the last significant inland power, by focusing instead on dominating the coastal cities and rewarding desert tribes. But this strategy ran counter to Egyptian interests. Eventually, it was the turmoil sparked by competing loyalties in Philistia that drew Kushite Egypt into open hostility. It seems likely that relations between Kush and Assyria remained stable up until the death of Sargon II in 705 BC. After that, both major powers appeared momentarily thrown off balance, each struggling to maintain control. From the perspective of Judah, located in the interior of the southern Levant, this was the ideal moment to assert independence. Sargon had died without ever subduing Egypt or diminishing its strength. The new Assyrian king was still untested. Meanwhile, Egypt under Kushite leadership had twice demonstrated its ability to decisively defeat any enemy on the battlefield. The Levantine coast remained independent, commercially vibrant, and generally hostile toward Assyrian domination. So it was not surprising that, in the face of renewed conflict with the empire beyond the Tigris, it was Hezekiah of Judah who stepped forward as leader. Both written and archaeological sources paint a clear picture of Judah's preparations for rebellion. Hezekiah reinforced the fortifications of his border towns, especially those to the north and west, anticipating an Assyrian counterattack from that direction. Large numbers of jars stamped with winged scarabs, frequently found in excavations from this period, reflect an effort to improve food collection and distribution through the royal Commissariat. At the same time, diplomatic activities surged. Embassies traveled back and forth, and Jerusalem became a center of political maneuvering. The Chaldean ruler, Marduk-Apolodon, himself resisting Assyrian rule, sent a delegation to support Hezekiah's efforts. Meanwhile, Hezekiah reached out to the Philistine and Phoenician cities, urging them to join a coalition against the new Assyrian king, Sennacherib. It's almost certain that he also made contact with Egypt and secured promises of military support from the Kushite regime. Appeals were largely successful, with many cities answering his call to resist Assyria. However, in the Philistine city of Ekron, the local king remained loyal to Sennacherib, refusing to break his oath. His refusal sparked outrage among the people, who rose up, overthrew him, and sent him to Jerusalem in chains. Hezekiah seized the opportunity to annex Ekron, gaining a strategic foothold in the coastal plain. The imprisonment of a loyal Assyrian vassal provided Sennacherib with all the justification he needed to launch a punitive campaign. In 701 BC, he swiftly mobilized his army and marched west. Though initially reluctant to engage deeply with the Levantan coast, Sennacherib quickly brought order to the region. He settled matters with Tyre and Sidon, whose king had fled, and received submission from the coastal cities. However, none of the rulers from the southern coast, except for Metinti of Ashdodop, appeared at this ceremonial gathering, an open insult to Assyrian authority, determined to reassert dominance. Sennacherib pressed southward along the Mediterranean, capturing Joppa and the surrounding area. This sudden shift in fortune caused many of the Philistine cities to surrender immediately. Sidkiah of Ashkelon, however, hesitated too long. He and his entire family were seized and deported to Assyria. In his place, Sharuladari, the son of a former king, was reinstated and made responsible for paying annual tribute. From there, Sennacherib turned inland, advancing into the Judean highlands. He captured the cities of Azekah and Gath, and finally laid siege to the fortified city of Lachish, which soon came under heavy attack. One can only imagine the despair that fell over King Hezekiah. Years of careful planning had unraveled in a matter of weeks, and the once promising coalition had disintegrated. Facing overwhelming pressure, Hezekiah offered to surrender. He sent messengers to the Assyrian camp pledging full submission, along with a substantial tribute as Lachish fell and nearby Libnah came under siege. Hezekiah was likely gripped by panic. Yet, it was at this darkest moment that events took an unexpected turn, one that would forever secure the prophet. Isaiah's place as the ultimate voice of divine intervention. As the Assyrians advanced down the coastal plain, a call for Egyptian military support was sent out. By the time the Egyptian forces arrived, Sennacherib's army was already deep into operations against Hezekiah's fortified hill towns. The arrival of the Egyptian expeditionary force, expected and swift, caught the Assyrians off guard. Had they known that, in Sennacherib's own words, an army beyond counting was approaching, they might never have committed to a siege in the Shephelah. Now, under the command of Shebetsu, the combined Egypto-Kushite force moved quickly through Philistia, pushing past Ashdod in an attempt to recapture Joppa and possibly outflank the Assyrians. Sennacherib, realizing the danger, abandoned the hill campaign and moved to confront them on the plains of Eltekeh, roughly 16 kilometers south of Joppa. Sennacherib's own records offer the most detailed account of what followed. He described how the people of Ekron, fearing for their city, had called upon the Egyptian kings and the forces of the Kushite king, bringing together an enormous army of archers, chariots, and cavalry. They gathered in battle formation on the plains of Eltekeh. Encouraged by a favorable omen from the god Ashur, Sennacherib claimed he launched an assault and defeated them. He even boasted of personally capturing Egyptian charioteers, nobles, and Kushite warriors in the heat of battle. The distinction Sennacherib made between kings of Egypt and king of Kush reveals that the Egyptian forces included both Nubian troops and militias from the delta, led by the so-called great chiefs of the Mihi. The Assyrians mistakenly referred to these local leaders as kings. This suggests that Shebetku had successfully persuaded or coerced these delta dynasts to join his cause. However, Sennacherib's version of events, especially his claim of total victories, not entirely convincing. His tale of personally engaging elite charioteers echoes famous battle tropes from earlier traditions, particularly the celebrated Battle of Kadesh, which had become legendary across the Near East. To complicate matters further, the events that followed Eltekeh, such as Padi's reinstatement in Ekron, the punishment of certain rebels, the continued assault on Judean towns, the siege of Jerusalem, and Hezekiah's tributad confusion. Notably, neither Ekron nor Jerusalem was said to have been taken. In fact, Sennacherib acknowledged that Hezekiah's tribute was sent only after he had returned to Nineveh. Since the sieges of Judean strongholds clearly occurred before the Battle of Eltekeh, it's likely that Sennacherib's narrative presented events out of chronological order, possibly to enhance the appearance of uninterrupted success. References to the Battle of Eltekeh in Egyptian sources are scarce and difficult to confirm. A relief at Medinet Habu, showing Sabako striking down his enemies, some of whom appear to be northerners, is too generic in style to be taken as solid historical evidence, since such scenes were often symbolic rather than literal. More intriguing is a scarab known as the Toronto scarab, which praises Sabako with exaggerated language typical of Egyptian royal inscriptions. It describes him as being more beloved by Ammon than any previous king, and claims that he defeated rebels in both Upper and Lower Egypt, as well as in foreign lands. It mentions enemies across the sand who were defeated and surrendered voluntarily, even capturing each other in the process, supposedly because of Sabako's devotion to his father. Though highly stylized, the term "those across the sand" may subtly refer to enemies beyond the Sinai, potentially including the Assyrians. Another significant clue comes from the Tangevar stela, which opens the possibility that not only Sabako, but also Shebetku, was present during the events at Eltekeh. If Shebetku's Kurul began around 705 BCE, his recorded ceremonial entry into Thebes 2 years later would fit the timeline for his presence in the north during the military campaign in Asia. What happened immediately after the battle is the most mysterious and dramatic part of the story, supported by 3 separate traditions. The biblical account states that during the night, an angel of Yahweh struck down 185,000 soldiers in the Assyrian camp. By morning, they were all dead, prompting Sennacherib to abandon the campaign and return home. Herodotus, writing centuries later based on what he was told in Egypt, relays a similar tale involving a priest king named Sethos. In his version, the invading Assyrians fled their positions and suffered heavy losses as they retreated. Another version comes from a Babylonian priest, whose story was later paraphrased by Josephus. He recounts that as Sennacherib was withdrawing from Egypt toward Jerusalem, a divine plague struck his army, killing 185,000 soldiers, including officers and generals, on the first night of a siege, possibly that of Jerusalem. While the alleged quote from Barassos closely echoes the biblical account and may have been exaggerated by Josephus, all three sources together suggest that some unexpected act of God disrupted the Assyrian campaign and prevented their victory. The idea that this disaster took place at Pelusiumor shortly after a retreat from there seems to stem from confusion with other major battles historically fought in that area between Egyptians and Asiatic invaders. Oddly enough, traditions of disease and even associations with mice have persisted in the region around Ashdod and Ashkelon places, far more likely to have been the actual setting of the event. For instance, the biblical account in 1 Samuel 4-6 tells a humorous tale in which the Philistines, after capturing the Ark of the Covenant from the Israelites, are struck by an embarrassing illness. In response, they send back the Ark, along with offerings shaped like mice, said to be destroying the land. A modern observer, R.A.S. McAllister, even reported witnessing mouse infestations in that region in 1904. Herodotus also recounts a legend in which the Scythians, while retreating north after being paid off by the Egyptian king Psammetichus, eluded the temple of the goddess Aphrodite at Ashkelon and were then afflicted with a strange woman's disease. Whatever the actual cause behind the abrupt end to Sennacherib's campaign in 701 BCE, the result was clear: a humiliating withdrawal from the southern Levant that lasted more than 2 decades. The combination of hard-fought resistance and a timely outbreak of disease elevated the reputation of the Kushites, who would dominate the regional stage for the next generation. The exact date of Sabaco's death remains unknown. His last known inscription is dated to his 15th regnal year. On the 11th day of the month Pani, the 10th month, which, if authentic, places him alive into the summer of 698 BCE, following Kushite tradition, the throne passed to the eldest son of the eldest brother Sebutu, son of Piankhy. If the graffiti on the Karnak key labeled number 33 truly refers to Shebutu's coronation in his 3rd year, it may suggest that he initially shared power in a co-regency. Since Shebetku was already exercising authority by 705 BCE, this shared rule could not have begun any later. If we take Sabetko's 15th year as valid, then Shebetku would have become sole ruler around the turn of the century. By the end of 698 BCE, he clearly ruled alone, becoming the first Kushite king to ascend the Egyptian throne while on Egyptian soil. In his 3rd year, Shebetku was established in Thebes, possibly making him the first Kushite monarch to live there. As Shebetku's reign continued, there may have been some doubt over who would succeed him. At some point between 697 and 692 BCE, he summoned his brothers and, likely his cousins, from Napata to Thebes. The aim may have been to gather the royal family under his supervision and to let Amen decide the next king, though not necessarily a co-regent, Taharqa. Later recalled this moment from years after his own ascension, His Majesty Taharqa came from the land of Nubia, a fine young man, the king's brother and beloved favorite. He journeyed north to Thebes, among the other fine youths summoned by King Shebetku from Nubia, and remained there with him. At the time, Taharqa was about 20 years old, the typical age when young men were drafted into state service in ancient Egypt. If Taharqa's own words are to be believed, he was met with overwhelming affection and admiration from both the royal court and the general public. He recalled, "I came from Nubia with the king's brothers whom he had summoned, and I stayed with him, for he loved me more than all his brothers and all his children. His Majesty chose me above all the rest. The nobles' hearts turned toward me, and everyone loved me. Still, the formal process of selection had to take place, and much of this language fits the standard portrayal of the ideal king. He is described as the son of Ammon, chosen by the god, with predictions of greatness made on his behalf, perhaps even within the temple sanctuary itself. Yet there is a cryptic mention of that which had not been known of me, along with a personal plea to the god, "Save me from the mouth of their words, and turn them back upon their own heads." These lines may hint at opposition to his rise. Was Taharqa simply expressing heartfelt concern when he prayed, "Preserve my wives, let my children live, and keep death away from them for me"? Or was he also fearing that, just as he had bypassed, Shebetku's children, one of his own sons, might one day be denied the throne? In any case, the Kushite tradition of favoring surviving brothers over sons provided a valid basis for Taharqa's claim. When Shebetku died around 690 BCE, assumed the throne to widespread celebration. He was crowned in Memphis, symbolic first for a Kushite ruler in Egypt. And, following custom, he retroactively set the start of his reign to New Year's Day on the Egyptian calendar. A short inscription from year 6 of Taharqa's reign captures the ideal qualities expected of any newly crowned Horus king. His Majesty is described as a man devoted to the gods, spending his days and even staying awake through the night seeking ways to serve them. He restored temples that had fallen into disrepair, recreated their sacred images in the manner of ancient times, rebuilt their storehouses, supplied their altars, and presented divine offerings of all kinds. He crafted libation tables from electrum, gold, silver, and copper. In doing so, his heart was at peace, knowing he was fulfilling his sacred duty daily. The land thrived under his rule. Much like it did in the days of the Eternal Lord, people basked in the sun without complaint, and justice prevailed throughout the land, driving out wrongdoing completely. The image of a tireless king, working for the good of his people, restoring religious sanctuaries, promoting prosperity, and upholding divine order is not a new one. This sort of royal rhetoric had been used since the Middle Kingdom. Yet in Taharqa's case, these weren't just hollow phrases. He truly lived up to the ideals expected of a ruler. By his 3rd year, work had already begun on rebuilding the sacred walls at Medinet Habu. By the 5th year, additions were being made to the temple at Edfu. It's clear that projects to benefit the cults of Amun and the Theban triad, whether in Thebes or Napato, were initiated from the very beginning of his rule. A unique personal element was added. When nature itself seemed to affirm Taharqa's divine favor, the late 8th century BCE saw increased rainfall across northeast Africa, and in Taharqa's 6th year, 685 BCE, the Nile experienced an unusually high flood. It was a perfectly timed event that reinforced the belief among Egyptians that this southern king had been chosen by the godsend Taharqa, made sure to highlight it. During the 6th year of His Majesty's reign, extraordinary events occurred, wonders not seen since the time of the ancestors. These were seen as signs of divine favor, for Amun-Re, his father, loved him. The king had been praying to Amun-Re, lord of Karnak, for a great inundation to prevent hardship in his time. When the season for the Nile's rise arrived, the waters began to swell, dramatically rising about a cubit each day over many days. The flood reached the cliffs of Upper Egypt and overflowed the mounds of Lower Egypt. The land was submerged, as if returned to the primeval sea, with no dry land emerging from the water. At Thebes, the floodwaters reached a height of 21 cubits, 1 palm and 2.5 fingers. His Majesty ordered the records of the ancestors to be consulted, hoping to find a similar event in past reigns, but nothing of this magnitude had ever been recorded. Rain had even fallen in Nubia, making the mountains shine. Following this editorial summary, the king himself speaks with enthusiasm. Nothing like this had ever been seen since the time of the ancestors. The flood came suddenly, like a thief in the night, and covered the entire land. It wasn't mentioned in any writings from the days of the forefathers. No one could say they'd heard of such a thing. From their own fathers, it made all the farmland rich again. It destroyed mice, killed snakes, and held back the locusts. The southern winds could not steal it away. I gathered the harvest into storage. The grain from Upper and Lower Egypt, along with many other native crops, was beyond counting. From Kush, she traveled north to Memphis to see her son for the first time since he had left her during Shebetku's reign. The king was deeply proud of the reunion and compared it to the divine moment when Isis beheld her son Horus seated on the throne of his father Osiris. The events of that remarkable year were celebrated and widely recorded throughout Egypt. Asterisk, after the Assyrians were driven back in 701 BC. The southern coast of the Levant was left in a power vacuum, given the energetic and ambitious nature of the Kushites. It's tempting to imagine that Shebet's would have moved swiftly to fill that void. However, evidence from the 690s is scarce. Shebet did adopt some of the militant titles once used by Thutmose III, but this alone isn't strong proof of military action. Slightly more intriguing is a depiction on the north face of the side of the outer wall of the temple of Osiris, ruler of eternity at Karnak. In this scene, Amun hands the HP sword to Shebet with the usual royal rhetoric about defeating foreign enemies. I grant you power like Montu. I give the southerners to your great crown, and the northerners to your red crown, king of Egypt, ruler of foreign lands, sovereign who seizes all lands. Whether this refers to the events of 701 or two later campaigns remains uncertain. For Taharqa, however, the historical record is much richer, thanks to recent excavations and new publications over the past 2 decades. The most helpful texts are the Kawa inventories, which detail offerings to the temple at Kawa in Nubia during the first 10 years of Taharqa's reign, 690 to 681 BC, until his 8th year, 683 BC. The records mention only standard religious items, ritual objects, and provisions, likely sourced from the Nile Valley. But in that 8th year, the entries take a different turn, listing items like a bronze statue of the king smiting foreign lands, and the children of the chiefs of the Jehinu. By the 10th year, 681 BC, the list includes cedar wood, Asiatic bronze, skilled gardeners from the Menti of Asia. These are clearly war spoils. The statue symbolizes military dominance, and the exotic materials and captives suggest campaigns in Libya and Asia between 684 and 681. Other references align with this military activity. Renovations in Thebes, led by Montumhat, mention using true cedar from the best of the terraces. Lebanon and Asiatic copper, likely tributes from these campaigns. The Libyan conflict might be echoed in inscriptions that list Oasis and Jehinu among conquered regions, a fragmentary stela from Karnak, though difficult to fully interpret, also appears to refer to this period of warfare. In it, the enemy is said to have made the first move. They did all this in marching against me. Taharqa then recounts his swift response. I went quickly to where they were. They were destined for a severe and terrible blow. I showed no mercy, not even to the least among them. The enemy is described as fleeing in terror, fear pulsing through their limbs. After his victory, Taharqa claims to have resettled the captives. I placed them in quarters, settled them in villages, and their cattle were brought, their goods in their hands. He concludes with a prayer to Amen. O Lord of the gods, grant me many years. You have been in my heart since youth. It was your great name I always spoke. I have brought you the riches of all lands and carried their treasures to Karnak. The impact of Taharqa's military campaigns is clearly reflected in records from Western Asia. While the Libyan campaign may have been more of a punitive expedition, his northern push successfully gained territory. Esarhaddon suggests that by the time of his invasion in 671 BC, southern Philistia, at least as far north as Ashkelon, was under Egyptian control. Additionally, the Phoenician cities of Tyre and Sidon had become strong allies of Taharqa. Following the fall of Samaria in 722 BC, Assyrian strategy had aimed to dominate the Levantan coastline and the Transjordan region, with the goal of isolating the central highlands of Palestine. But this objective had only been partially achieved. Assyria had made unchallenged gains in Transjordan, though this region was the least valuable in terms of strategic and economic returns. Along the coast, Egypt still held a slight but tangible upper hand, at least in potential. The Kushites had not only taken control of Egypt and repelled the Assyrians, but they had even launched counteroffensives. Their continued success, unshaken by failure, filled them with a bold confidence that inspired new and creative forms of celebration. A unique commemorative stela captures a glimpse of Taharqa in full public display, reveling in his power, proudly showcasing the fitness of his elite troops, and even joining them in their training. The inscription describes how the king ordered his 5 battalions to run every day. Taharqa declared with pride, "How wonderful are the deeds my father Amen has done for me. No king before me has experienced anything like this. He has allowed me to crush the 9 bows, now lying beneath my feet. All that the sun shines upon serves me willingly, without opposition across the lands beneath the heavens. There are no cowards among my troops, no weak arms among my recruits." Taharqa personally traveled into the highlands to observe his armies. Prowess, they moved like the wind, swift as birds in flight. Even his household guards were so skilled that they were indistinguishable from the regular forces. The king, likened to the war god Montu and the wise Thoth, led by example. He was strong, intelligent, and unmatched in every endeavor he rode in his chariot to oversee his army's training, and even ran with them across the desert near Memphis at sunset, reaching Fayum by dawn. They returned to the capital by morning, and Taharqa honored the top performers by letting them eat and drink with his household guards. This stela presents a striking contrast to the usual narrative of Taharqa as a tragic figure doomed to defeat. At the end of the 7th century, BC's first quarter, he saw himself as an unbeatable commander, certain that no enemy could challenge his forces in open combat. This raises 2 important questions. How could someone with such a powerful army suffer a sudden and humiliating loss? And why, despite this defeat, did Taharqa continue to be remembered as a great conqueror? Before confronting the implications of these questions, however, we must first look at the Kushite accomplishments within Egypt itself.